वाली खाना काबा ये पुकारा मिलके लगाओ सभी हैदरी नारा.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Our proof number 13 in reference to the invalidity of the ritual of Taraweeh is the account of Zayd ibn Thabit, which states that as the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam did not come to the mosque to perform his recommended prayers, the band of Sahaba who wanted to perform Taraweeh gathered outside the house of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam and started shouting and making noise and clamoring and also throwing rocks at the door of the house of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam. Proof number 13 focuses on the fact that the Sahaba shouted and yelled and rose their voices outside the house of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam while calling him to come and hold the ritual for them. This is obviously and manifestly and without any doubt a very repulsive act, and it is a remarkable act of rudeness and a grotesque display of lack of respect for the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, and goes against the verses of the noble Quran which call the Muslims to observe the respect of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam in all circumstances, especially so when calling him and when addressing him. And especially the verses of the noble Quran prohibit Muslims from calling the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam and yelling at him from outside his house. Let me read to you both verses. The verse that urged the Muslims to call the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam not in the manner that they would call each other, and also the verse which reminds the Muslims that they are not allowed to call the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam in a yelling manner from outside his house. This is the Quran that's published by the Saudi authorities in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah with a translation that's amicable to them. Al-Quran Al-Kareem, published by King Fahd Complex for Printing of the Noble Quran, page number 478. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لا تجعلوا دعاء الرسول بينكم كدعاء بعضكم بعضا. Make not the calling of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam among you as you were calling one of another. In other words, do not call the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam as you would call each other. What Sahaba committed by yelling at the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and shouting him out, this was obviously a violation of this verse of the noble Quran. And the other verse, which is more specific, is in Surah Al-Hujurat. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الذين يغضون أصواتهم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا ترفعوا أصواتكم فوق صوت النبي صلى الله عليه وآله ولا تجهروا له بالقول كجهر بعضكم لبعض أن تحبط أعمالكم وأنتم لا تشعرون. O you who believe, raise not your voices above the voice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, nor speak aloud to him in talk as you speak aloud to one another, lest your deeds should be rendered fruitless while you perceive not. While you do not realize, your deeds will be rendered void and without any reward before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you should raise your voices at the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, or you raise your voices in the presence of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. إن الذين يغضون أصواتهم عند رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله أولئك الذين امتحن الله قلوبهم للتقوى. Verily, those who lower their voices in the presence of Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, they are the ones whose hearts Allah has tested for piety. لهم مغفرة وأجر عظيم, for them is forgiveness and a great reward. In other words, those who raise their voices in the presence of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam or from outside his house, their hearts were not tested for piety or iman, Rather, their hearts were devoid of piety in iman. إن الذين ينادونك من وراء الحجرات أكثرهم لا يعقلون. Verily, those who call you from behind the dwellings, from behind the house, most of them have no senses. لا يعقلون means that they do not comprehend, they do not understand, they do not cogitate. This is a rather very harsh condemnation for those who call out the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam and shout his name from outside his house, that they do not comprehend. And lack of comprehension is a denunciation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has reserved in the Holy Quran for the worst of and the basest of all human beings. In Surah An-Nur, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I apologize, in Surah Al-Anfal, verse number 22. This is Surah Al-Anfal, verse number 22. إن شر الدواب عند الله الصم البكم الذين لا يعقلون. Verily, the worst of moving living creatures before Allah are the deaf and the dumb, and the deaf and the dumb who understand not, the disbelievers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order to imply and illustrate that those who do not believe after knowing the facts and after seeing the facts, they still do not affirm and still do not acknowledge the truthfulness of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa and the veracity of articles of faith, they are worse. They are the worst of all animals, the worst of all beasts. لا يعقلون. And then the verse in Surah Al-Hujurat, what I showed to you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that those who shout at the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam from outside his house are لا يعقلون, are people who comprehend not. And this verse, إن شر الدواب عند الله الصم البكم الذين لا يعقلون. The worst of all beasts are the dumb and the deaf who comprehend not. Therefore, this attribute in the Noble Quran and this feature in the Noble Quran of the people to describe them as of being devoid of comprehension, to describe them being devoid of understanding, who do not have common sense, who do not cogitate, who do not think, لا يعقلون. This is a very harsh attribute reserved for those people who are outside the bounds of Islam, not only outside the bounds of Islam, but who do not deserve a speck of respect, and who are lower and more degraded than the worst of the animals and the worst of the beasts. إن شر الدواب عند الله الصم البكم الذين لا يعقلون. The worst and the lowest of all beasts are those deaf and the dumb who do not comprehend. So the 13th proof in reference to the invalidity of the ritual of Taraweeh is articulated as follows. The number of Sahaba who were insistent on holding Taraweeh prayers, they gathered outside the house of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and shouted at him and yelled his name from outside his house. And the Noble Quran has condemned those who shouts at the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam or yelled his names from outside his house as people who comprehend not. And people who comprehend not, according to the Quranic verse, are lower of all beasts, lower than dogs, lower than pigs, lower than any beast imaginable. Therefore, that band of Sahaba and their grotesque lack of respect and their very hideous and repulsive offense with respect to the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, as far as their action of yelling and raising their voices and shouting the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and shouting his name from outside his house is concerned, they are lower than any beast, lower than any animal. While the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is not only reluctant but refuses to be part of Taraweeh. those who demand that Taraweeh should be upheld are such low creatures. Therefore, Taraweeh cannot be a rite, cannot be a ritual that's seen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with comfort and with pleasing eyes. Therefore, the canonicity of Taraweeh is rejected and disproved.